what should I hope for? What's worth investing my life in? In what does the worthiness of our shared humanity consist, right? How do I lean into what's really worth investing in life? What if our most fundamental place to build from actually are shared questions rather than shared answers?
Hi, friends. I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of personal pain and social division. I'm really grateful for today's guest, Matt Croasmun. Matt is the director of the Life Worth Living program at the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. He has so much to offer, wisdom and humility, and he's just a really friendly, wonderful guy. I'm really grateful for him. And you'll get to hear more about Matt and about the Life Worth Living program throughout this conversation because Matt has co-authored a book on that very topic. So this is a book about big questions and about why it really matters that we learn how to ask those questions. The questions like, what is worth hoping for? What is worth living for? Does my life matter and why? Those types of questions. So this is a book about those questions and how to pursue the answers to them and how to learn how to disagree with respect and friendship and kindness in the midst of those questions. And I will add here in this introduction that Matt and I talked about something before we started recording that I don't think came up again in our conversation. And that is that there's a mental health crisis in America right now that seems to be particularly acute among young adults. And for me, as the mother of 3 adolescent kids, as someone who's lived on school campuses for the past 20 years, I am paying a lot of attention and I'm feeling particular concern about this situation. And I think there are a variety of factors at work. There certainly is more than one answer to the question of why our kids are in this place of distress, anxiety, depression, on down the list. And the experience they had during COVID, the rise of social media over the past 10 years certainly is part of that explanation. But I also believe that our teens are experiencing a mental health crisis because we are experiencing a spiritual crisis and a crisis of meaning and purpose and of knowing whether our lives matter and how to approach those questions as a society. And I think the teens are feeling that. So I commend this book and this conversation to all the people who are not just looking for easy answers or for a life on the surface, but for all of us who want to give to our children a courageous, thoughtful, accessible, hopeful way to pursue a meaningful life. So I hope this conversation is just one step along that journey, and I hope you'll enjoy it. Well, I'm sitting here today with my friend Matt Croasmun. Matt, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I am excited for many reasons to have you here, but especially because of this new book that you have co-written that is called Life Worth Living, A Guide to What Matters Most. And I happen to know some of the backstory because I've been paying attention to the course that you and others have been teaching for, I think, almost a decade now at Yale University called Life Worth Living. And so I thought maybe we could start with just a description of that course, who takes it, how did it start, what is it, and then that'll lead us into the book that is coming out of that course.
Sure. Well, this course in many ways sort of began as our answer. I say our. My colleagues and I, Ryan McAnally-Linz and Miroslav Wolf, actually the two of them taught the course the first time around. This course sort of began as like our answer to what we think is a sort of false choice that we often encounter in universities like Yale, where one of our colleagues at the law school, Anthony Croasmun, wrote this book about 12 years ago, probably now, called Education's End. Why our colleges and universities have given up on the meaning of life.
Which I literally have flagged on my bookshelf. It's in my to be read pile right now. So we're tracking with each other already. I guess I'm 12 years late, but go on.
There you go. Well, between you and me, I think his diagnosis is like halfway right. But in his diagnosis, in part, it talks about sort of the development of the university, more and more specialization. We can't think about the big questions anymore, these sorts of things. I think that's quite right. But then he himself sort of falls into a trap that I think is this sort of false choice where he sort of suggests, well, the problem these days is the language I think he uses in the book is multiculturalism. Basically the problem is he sees it as a sort of a preference to have a sort of diverse and inclusive community. Why is that a problem? Well, because it means we don't all have our sort of shared a shared set of values on the basis of which we can talk about life's really big questions and with some sort of basis of agreement. And so I think there he's sort of fallen into this false choice that I think we've seen in many, many places in our universities and in our culture at large, where we sort of think that either we can have, on the one hand, a homogeneous community where we all basically agree on some sort of foundational principles from which we can sort of answer life's big questions. How should I live? To whom am I responsible? For Croasmun, that's the secular, modern, Western liberal tradition, the sort of great books of the Western canon. Or we think, on the other hand, our only other option is to have a diverse, inclusive community, but one in which, because it's diverse and inclusive, we're just going to have to privatize our answers to the big questions of life. And so the question of the good life, of what actually is a life worth wanting for ourselves, for our communities, for people we care about, that question, this false choice suggests that question, if we're going to have an inclusive community, we're just going to have to all go think about that question on our own and on our own time and in private spaces. And to whatever extent a college classroom is something like a public space, at least public for the folks that are in the room, then we can't take up life's big questions in that space. And really, in certain ways, like, this course has been a sort of 10-year project to demonstrate that is a false choice, that in fact we can have a conversation that leans into the sort of diversity and pluralistic sort of context that a place like Yale College offers as a tremendous sort of resource and place in which to precisely ask life's big questions, and not just in some sort of anthropological sense, like, I don't know, like, what have people thought about these questions, but to wrestle with the truth of these questions for ourselves. And so we like to say that in Life Worth Living, we're inviting young people to sort of marry their most, the best of their intellectual energies with their most profound existential questions. And when you allow students to put those two things together and to do that around a table with people very much unlike them, interacting with texts from all around the globe and across human history, there's a really, really sort of dynamic conversation that's possible there.
Yeah, absolutely. I can only imagine. The book itself, well, I got to tell a story. So I was sitting at a bar. I don't think I've ever said that on this podcast before, but I was eating lunch on a trip alone at a bar, and I was reading your book, and a guy who's also eating lunch down the row from me or whatever, a couple stools away, at some point tries to start a conversation with me, and he says, "Oh, so, what are you reading?" And I said, "Oh, I'm reading a book called Life Worth Living." And so he's like, "Oh, is it fiction?" And I said, "No." And I'm like, "I don't want to talk to you about this." But anyway, so then he's like, "Oh, well, okay, so what's it about?" And I said, "Well, it's basically a primer on moral philosophy that's based on a course taught to undergraduates at Yale." And I was like kind of laughing at myself as I'm telling him this, like, I can't believe this is what I'm reading over my lunch alone at the bar. And then he was like, "So do you just feel terrible about yourself the whole time that you're reading it?" And it was one of those things where I was like, "Well, no, I really don't." But also the fact that that's where he went immediately in the idea of like philosophical questions about life and the idea of really wanting to engage those deep questions being an exercise in feeling terrible about yourself, which I mean, and that was the end of our conversation for perhaps a lot of obvious reasons.
You just experienced a little taste of what it's like when someone asks you, like, what do you do for a living? And you have to answer, you are a theologian.
Oh, amen
right?
to that.
And you just like hear a pin drop, and they're like, "Oh no, what have I done? Why did I ask that question?"
Pretty much. So that leads me back to my question, which is, who is who's taking this class?
Hmm.
I mean, people aren't reading the book yet because it's just about to come out, but like who will be reading this book, and
Yep.
why do we ask these questions? Because I really don't think we ask them in order to feel terrible about ourselves.
Yeah. Well, so first thing, at the for the course, we have students from all across the college, and every once in a while, some management students who are really good at negotiate their way into the course. You got to be aware of those management students; they're sneaky. But mostly, it's undergraduates, and they really, we've done some, we tried to like tabulate the data, like basically. The spread of majors in our class is about the same as the spread of majors among the undergraduates, which is to say,
Hmm.
a lot of psychology majors, a lot of economics majors, a lot of biology
Yeah.
majors of various sorts. So we've got this is not specialists, students who are just studying philosophy or religion. And I think that speaks to what you're saying about why we ask these questions. I think we ask these questions because we're human beings, and because we don't often ask them. But let's be honest. I think it's part of what we're trying to do with this book is actually like prompt folks to stop and ask, because I think most often we just do what we do because that's what we do, and life is busy, and parenting takes a lot of time. I mean, I guess our undergraduates aren't dealing with that, but for all of us in the world, we got a lot of things that we got to think about. But the fact is human beings, we do things for reasons, or at least we invent reasons after the fact, or we have them beforehand, or whatever it might be. We aim at certain sorts of goals, or we want to, and pausing and thinking about those goals. I mean, that's really what we're. I mean, one of our chapters, right, is just called "What Should I Hope
Hmm.
For." And I think that's a lot of what we're after in this book is those sorts of like what's worth hoping for. Um, not that sort of self-flagellating sort of like, oh no, what a terrible screw up I am, or whatever. But what should I hope for? What's worth investing my life in? In what does the worthiness of our shared humanity
Yeah.
consist? Right? How do I lean into what's really worth investing in life? Um, those are questions that maybe we're forced to ask. That's actually maybe part of what we mean when we say we come to like quarter or midlife
Right.
crises, where there's like big transitions in our lives. We're sort of forced in moments like that to ask those questions. Um, but uh, they're worth asking. Maybe not. Maybe before we get into those crisis moments, if we
Yeah.
can like be intentional and deliberate about it, it can serve us well for later when we inevitably do come into those crises. And it is a great privilege to be able to do it, but it's at the same time, we always say we're living answers to these questions, whether or not we could give those answers. And so, um, taking a moment to really think about it and consider and maybe talk about it with some trusted friends or neighbors, that's it's just I think it's part of taking ourselves seriously.
Yeah.
Um, and your barmate is not it's not wrong that there are moments where that's
Yeah.
uncomfortable, right? You take a look at like who you want to be, and take a look at who you are at the moment, and there's a gap there, and that can be uncomfortable, but at the same time, um, having standards is not far from having hopes, right? Having moral
Yeah.
aspirations, and those can be good and really motivating and orienting to our lives.
Well, so can you give an example? You just said something about like we're living the answers, whether or not we
Mm.
are conscious of that or thinking about it. Like, can you give examples? Because I think you all do this well in the book of some of the ways that we live out those questions, perhaps without even knowing. Oh, we've all been drinking the same water, and it results in the same,
Yeah.
growth happening or not
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah. So one thing we do early on in the book is so we have exercises throughout the book, and one thing we do early on, maybe even the first set of exercises, we sort of ask the reader to take an inventory. Where are you investing your time, your money, and your attention? And I think that's one of those places where, man, if you look at those three
Yeah.
things, um, you're going to get, especially if you can be honest about it. And, we even think about like, no, we don't mean like just think about it. We mean like, look at your calendar,
Right.
look at your checkbook or your mint.com or
Right.
whatever it might be. Look at your, browser history or your most recently used apps or whatever it might be, to think about attention. Um, yeah, you're going to get some truth back there. And we think that, one of the things that you might find, one of these really sort of prominent visions we think is sort of out there in the
Yeah.
water, is what we call the Walgreens vision. Long, happy, and
Yeah.
healthy, right? So Walgreens used to have the slogan at the corner, that Walgreens was at the corner of happy and healthy. We add long, to that. Who would want to have a happy and healthy life if it wasn't also a long life? That's probably part of why we want a healthy life. But these are some of these things that we just sort of live for, which is to say that we live for sort of bare life. And I'm not sure anyone's gonna stand up and advocate for sad, what is it, short, sad, and sickly.
Right.
But surely there's more to it than just living, for just bare life itself. And we can see that in lives that we admire, who, for the sake of something more valuable, are willing to put their lives at risk. And maybe their lives aren't as long as they could have been, put their health at risk. Maybe they're not as healthy as they might have been, put their, certainly like their enjoyment, put their enjoyment of
Right.
life second, and in some, at least thin sense, their happiness, they readily, sort of compromise on. But those obviously aren't the only places. We seem to live for, sort of career accomplishments
Right.
instead of, meaningful relationships. We live for reputation instead of for character.
Mhm.
Just like we're constantly sort of, driven, especially in our social media environment, right, to live for reputation in ways that, probably aren't worth it if we take a moment to pause and consider. So yeah, those are some of
Yeah.
those things where like, well, shoot, like, you sit down, you look at your checkbook, you look at your calendar, you look at what you're reading and watching, and you're like, oh shoot, maybe I'm living for some things that, aren't, maybe in the final accounting, really worth being quite so central to my life.
Yeah, and I think you all do a great job in the book of just sharing short anecdotes that do cause a reader to say, "Oh, right, okay." Martin Luther King is kind of an easy example of someone whose life involved suffering and ended prematurely, and was also one that was, even in his own reckoning, knowing that what he was doing was probably leading him to that end, was worth it. And it's hard to imagine someone, looking back at his life and saying that it was not a life worth living. Whereas if you compared it to someone who was probably in a safer or happier or healthier place, right? Um,
Yeah.
you can ask a lot of good questions from that. And you all do that, I think, well in the book. And I guess to this point, one of the things that I really appreciated, and this also goes back to your original, thought about there being a false dichotomy to say we can either privatize this, if we're gonna be diverse, then we have to privatize this. And, what the book does, and I imagine the class doing, is weaving together religious, philosophical, moral traditions, and you do that without pretending that they are different versions of the same message. Because at least for me, I feel like growing up in like the 80s and the 90s, I got a lot of like, religions, all different religions are paths up the same mountain. And so, yes, they might look different, but you're all going to the same goal. Or, everyone's blindfolded and their hand is on a different part of the elephant. And so you're feeling the tail and I'm feeling the trunk. And we think we're feeling different
Yeah.
things. It's actually the same.
Why does this poor elephant keep getting groped? I don't understand. Someone's got to stand up for the poor elephant.
Well,
But
let's
yeah,
stand up for the elephant and make it clear that, what you're trying to do is say, actually, there are some questions in common. And actually, I would love for you to talk a little bit about why having questions in common matters in the way that,
yeah,
but then also there are different answers. And I thought maybe we could explore a topic and just get an example of like, here are some different answers to a common question. So, yeah, so I'm going to back myself up here and just ask you to speak a little bit to the, um, significance of having common questions. But then I'd love to talk about having diverse answers.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, our world would be a lot simpler and we'd have a lot less conflict if at the end of the day we really did all want, exactly the same thing, or if we did really sort of all have the exact same set of values and it was just some sort of, yeah, blind men feeling the different parts of the elephant or whatever sort of analogy you'd want. I mean, that would be convenient, but I think like conflict in our world makes it pretty clear. I mean, it's I don't just mean like war and I mean like even in our ideologies and in our political disagreements. I think some of our political disagreements are disagreements about visions of a good
Yeah.
life, right? We're not having political arguments these days. We're having fewer and fewer, I think, political arguments these days about just simply the different strategies for achieving the same ends.
Hmm.
We're having disagreements about what ends are actually worth
Right.
achieving. And I think many of those conversations really matter, actually.
Hmm.
I think there are sort of moral questions at stake. And so anyways, to me, that's just sort of patently obvious that we there are genuine disagreements
Yeah.
here and not just apparent disagreements. But that does point to just what you're saying, that well, then what is our common ground? If our common ground isn't some sort of lowest common denominator of like, oh, somewhere way down there we share sort of common commitments to freedom or kindness or something like that. I mean, I don't, there are places of agreement,
Yeah.
but what if our most fundamental place to build from actually are shared questions
Hmm.
rather than shared answers? I think my one of my great sort of disappointments or regrets, I don't know, about my college, my time in college, that maybe in certain ways I'm trying to sort of make up for now in my role in the college classroom as a teacher, is when I was a college student, my life was completely upended by these big questions.
Yeah.
Um, I came in actually oriented, I think, sort of unbeknownst to myself. I wouldn't have ever wanted to say it this way, but sort of like my life was oriented around reputation
Mm.
in certain ways, and it took a lot of very kind people and a sort of persistent, in my case, faith community to help me gradually sort of get a picture of what that was, and to help me come to the conclusion that in my case, some sort of pursuit of fame or a particular sort of reputation, wherever, just wasn't worth being the center of my life. But that all happened largely within a pretty relatively homogeneous religious community.
Right.
And as much as that was, and it was absolutely revolutionary in my life, and really, really important, and I'm still invested in Christian communities to this day. At the same time, I found I was completely inarticulate, unable to even talk about what it was that I was learning or the questions that I was asking with my friends that weren't part of that community. And I
Hmm.
had tons of those friends, but I didn't know how to bring these questions into those relationships. And I have been sort of I've been sort of wrecked over the last 10 years in the best sort of way you know, uh, for anything less than a conversation that involves people who genuinely see things differently, right? Where what we share in common are shared questions rather than shared answers.
Mm.
And to be able to, um, yeah, to say to um, my secular humanist friends, like let's consider this question together. To say to my Buddhist friends, like let's consider, this question
Yeah.
together. That I think there's just like there's still, as I said, I'm a ordained Christian pastor, for goodness sakes. I'm still very much invested in religious communities. I'm especially, for what it's worth, invested in those communities when they're able to center questions at least as much as they do answers. Um, but um, but I'm also like I just think like it's an important part of our lives to be able to, because that's actually when we have to do that difficult work of articulation. Because I think at the end of the day, my undergraduate self not only was unable to articulate my answers or even my questions to folks that weren't part of my religious community, that also just means that I wasn't articulating for myself
Yeah.
very well my questions and my sort of evolving answers. Not as well as I could have. So does that make sense? It's not just a matter of
Yeah.
like, oh, interfaith conversation or dialogue, or I mean, those do have value just in and of themselves, but they also have value for us as individuals because they actually require us to like know what we're talking about and not sort of fall back into whatever kind of religious or philosophical or cultural jargon
Yeah.
happens to work in our sort of, again, important but sort of smaller, more heterogeneous, more homogeneous spaces. So yeah, I'm a big proponent these days of communities built around shared questions.
Yeah, I mean, that really resonates with me as well because I do think there's a safety in homogeneity, but there is also can be, without even intending to, like a shallowness or a lack of rootedness. And there's an expansiveness that can come. For me as a Christian, I remember when I first was really introduced to and developed respect for divergent, whether it was divergent views within the Christian tradition or outside of it. That was scary at first, and yet over time, it actually expanded my own commitments as a Christian, actually, as well
Mm,
as my respect
mm,
for people who did not share those commitments,
mm,
and enabled a richness of learning and growth for sure.
mm,
So I have two other thoughts. One is also just this is backing up a little bit, but in that whole idea of maybe we just need to keep this all private so that it doesn't offend anyone. And yet, I think one of the places where we're seeing that wreak havoc in our culture is in the political realm. Because the whole
mm,
point of the political realm is that it's public and we don't have the same commitments necessarily. And so, if we can't learn how to talk with one another about disagreements, whether that's disagreement over the means, the ends, what the question should be. I don't know. It seems like this has implications outside of even just being able to develop those friendships and have those conversations on the kind of religious and moral and spiritual level, which seems really important to me. But it also seems like it's a primer for some of those
yes.
conversations that really we're not doing well as a society right now. And I think this might be part of why, because we've said, well, the things you really care about need to be private. And it's like, well, actually, they can't be. And so
Mhm.
we need to remember or learn, if we've never known, how to do this in public without simply not listening to each other, cutting each other down, et cetera. So anyway, that was just a thought I had while you were speaking. But I wanted to ask if you could give an example of a topic. These come up in the book. So the question of purpose, the question of suffering, the question of what to do after we fail, any of those or
Mhm.
something else.
Mhm.
But where
Yeah.
can you just give us literally like okay, here are 3 or 4 different ways that people
Yeah.
think about that question and they don't agree, and that would be good to explore.
Yeah, I mean, the first question that we take up this way in the book is this question of responsibility. And here we mean not just who are you responsible for, but actually mostly we're trying to think of who are you responsible to?
Mm-hmm.
Like, who do you answer to for the shape of your life? We use the image of Smokey the Bear pointing his paw at you, telling you that only you can prevent forest fires. And or sorry, wildfires. Smokey the Bear has changed his sphere of
Oh.
concern since I was a
Good to
child,
know.
which
Good to know.
I was informed of this by the Forest Service while we were trying to get permission to put in a picture of Smokey the Bear in the book. We did not get
Oh my
permission.
goodness.
It's okay. But yeah, so we think about this question of responsibility, and one. So what's Confucius's answer? Who are you responsible to? For Confucius, you're responsible to your sort of community of origin, first of all, right? And this sort of first and foremost, your responsibility is to your parents.
Mm-hmm.
Your responsibility is to your family, to your close community, your town, and it sort of emanates out in sort of concentric circles of responsibility. For many Muslims, the answer, and for many adherents of Abrahamic traditions, the answer is you're responsible to God.
Yeah.
But many Muslims will tell a story that's quite striking on this point. We sort
Mm.
of say, like, all of us, before we entered this world, we stood before Allah, and we promised to live by His commands.
Mm.
And we call it in the book the most important promise you don't remember making, right? I mean, but
Yeah.
this is this sort of account of, like, it doesn't matter whether you remember it. You made this promise, and so you have this responsibility to God, not just because God created you, but also because you've made a commitment to live as God um, requires. Immanuel Kant thinks that we're responsible most of all, perhaps, to reason, to this sort of standard, this natural moral law that is, in a very important sense, sort of outside of us, in that it's like it is a standard that we have very much. In anybody who knows much about Kant knows just how high that standard is, or how difficult it is to achieve. But we access it through reason. It's not because it's a tradition handed down to us. It's not because God said so. Kant has plenty of ideas about God, but he doesn't think you need them necessarily for morality. You simply you're responsible to reason, which then also makes you in a certain way responsible to all reasonable people. You have to answer to them and be able to give an account for your course of action, and that course of action needs to be a course of action that you could recommend for everyone. And then finally, we have sort of the possibility advanced these days by many folks that maybe we're ultimately truly and only responsible to ourselves.
Right.
We're a bit dubious about that last one. It carries with it the worries about arbitrariness. We're responsible only to ourselves. There can be a sort of unbearable lightness of being, as it were, a sort of sense that it's all arbitrary. It's all just arbitrary preference all the way down. There are more robust ways of thinking about a responsibility to oneself, including, for what it's worth, theistic versions of that. Maybe we're responsible to become our most authentic selves,
Right.
but we answer not to our authentic selves, or at least not directly, or not ultimately, but we answer to the God who created us, or the God who has given us a particular vocation to become particular selves. But anyway, you can see in all of these different ways that you get very different sorts of answers. And maybe like just one more concrete sort of piece of this is, it's always striking to me in the Analects, in the Analects of Confucius, it's 1318. Confucius tells or is told a story by someone who comes in and says, Confucius, you have to understand how righteous people are, how morally upright people are in my country. In my country, when a father steals a sheep, his son turns him in. And Confucius says, in my country, the people do things differently. A son covers for his father, and a father covers for his son, and there is also justice in what they do. And so you get this sort of this really striking sort of different. And again, you got to be careful with that. Confucius certainly believes in sort of in a universal sphere of moral responsibility. Confucius isn't suggesting help your father get away with murder, but there is a different sense of responsibility and answerability. So anyway, so it gives you a sense, and as you say, throughout the book, every question that we could possibly take up, we find multiple divergent, important differences. Not just sort of like, look, this puts a slight emphasis here versus a slight emphasis there. No, these are sending us often in, if not polar opposite, still in very importantly different directions about how we might think of our lives, what we might do. Again, where we might look for the hope of what is most worthy in our lives.
Thank you so much just for taking the time to give us one, and as you said, that is just one example of what is really a rich tapestry of different lines of thought and places of overlap, as well as of real divergence between these different traditions that are both ancient and modern in different ways. One question that came up for me in reading the book, and this comes particularly because of my own experience as the mother of a child with Down syndrome and with disability. So the question of kind of life worth living comes up a lot in the context of disability circles. And it obviously comes up outside of them as well, whether that's talking about, people with terminal illness or who are elderly or who are just undervalued by society for all sorts of different reasons. But it seems to me that there really are people who are deemed not worthy of life in different ways and for different reasons across different traditions, etc. But I'm just wondering how you would respond to just the question of people having unworthy lives, or,
Yeah.
and it seems to me again that the different traditions would come at that differently. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I just would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, this is a really important question, and it's maybe one of the only questions that we treat differently, both in our course and in the book. In the course, we tell students on the very first day, the title of this course, Life Worth Living, may bring up for you the question of whether your life is worth living.
Right.
And I just want to tell you, actually, that's not what this course is about. For what it's worth, and we think it's worth a lot. We want you to know your life is worth living. Every human life is worth living. And that's not a question we're going to consider in this class, like whether, which lives might be worth living and which ones wouldn't be. That's just not how we're going to think about it here. Instead, this course is an exploration in what does the worthiness of our shared humanity sort of consist? Like, where does it lie? And I think disability studies, reflection on disability, I think really helps us sort of be careful as we sort of think about places where we might locate that worthiness.
Yeah.
It can't be an ability. Our worthiness can't be in our abilities. We say in the book, all ability is temporary.
Yeah.
It's and no ability is universal in the human community. There's what we all are potentially objects of love. Again, if you're coming from a theistic point of view, we are in fact all objects of love.
Right.
There are feminist approaches within disability studies that I find really compelling that begin with the thought that we were all loved by someone, by a caregiver. That has been true for us at some point in our lives. So I think it's a really, really important question. And the way we deal with it in the book, we try to deal with it like before you even get to the text. This is why we say, after we dedicate the book to our students, we then say, to our readers, your life is worth living. And we hope this book helps you more profoundly appreciate the worthiness of our shared humanity. But you're not wrong. And, of course one can, and many people have sort of, you could take it up as a philosophical question, and you would find voices who would want to distinguish some even human lives as not worth living. Peter Singer,
Right.
Who's a thinker whom we engage. Do we?
You do.
We certainly engage in our
he comes
course.
up
We
a
engage in
couple
the book.
times.
He comes up. He has really he makes, I think, profound moral error in his determination or his arguments that there are some lives that are not worth living. Anyway, like I said, for us, that's a question that we take up almost every question as a sort of like, oh, let's take it up and let's see where various people land. For us, that's just a question that we don't treat the same way. We want to treat that as a question we just want to like name as answered for us, and sort of constitutive, and that answer being constitutive of the conversation in some sort of way.
And would you say, perhaps with like utilitarianism, which Peter Singer is at least one, he's one strand of, would the other traditions that you represent, I mean, obviously you are representing a Christian tradition, even though you're doing that in a very pluralistic way and inviting dialogue with lots of other traditions. Would you say that the other traditions that you all are exploring have a shared assumption that life is worth living? That human life is worth living?
That is a good question. I should say, first of all, that I wouldn't profess to have expertise enough to I mean, especially phrased as a universal
Sure.
sort
Yes.
of
And I'm not trying
question.
to back you into a corner. It's
No,
more
no, no,
just
no,
that
no. But I'm just trying to be careful and think about it, because I want to be honest. Even in my own theological tradition, of course, there are Christians who will argue, I think, in really troubling ways about trying to sort of limit the bounds of the human community. I mean, that's the other thing, right? Like, all human lives are worth living. Oh, now we've qualified it. Where are we drawing that human boundary?
Yes.
Because that's obviously in the history of Christian thought in this country, the boundaries of the human community haven't always extended across,
Mm,
even across racial lines.
yeah.
And so, um, I think there are possibilities of, um, certainly of what Miroslav has called. Sort of malfunctions of religious traditions.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
so maybe we would want to say in some sort of normative or charitably normative sort of sense, right? We'd want to say that like at their best, it seems that these other traditions, like the Christian one, I think the Christian one at its best is going to affirm
Yes.
all the worthiness of all human lives. And it's going to expand the circle of humanity as broadly as possible. I mean, of course, like one of the things that like our some of our Buddhist interlocutors would take us to task on, and some of our utilitarian interlocutors would as well, is like, why do you keep using that word human?
Mm,
And shouldn't we be talking about the worthiness of life,
yeah.
full stop?
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean that I think there are, again, as in all places, we may find sort of places of overlapping consensus that are important. And like I said, this book is sort of built on an overlapping consensus that all human lives are worth living. And we might find that I think most of our interlocutors in the traditions and communities that we're talking about, I think, can join us in that. And like I said, some of them would even push us to open that circle wider.
Right, right. Well, so, and that leads me, I have like two more questions for you. I mean, I have many, but I'm going to only ask two more. One is that I'm curious for you as a Christian who has been working on, in this class and on this book, what are some things that have informed how you think, how you see the world, how you understand what it means to live a life worth living? That perhaps surprised you that came from outside of your
Mm,
Christian tradition? Like, what are some ways in which
yeah.
the other ways
Yeah.
of seeing have informed your own practice of
Hmm.
living?
Oh, how much time do you have? I'll give you at least two, maybe a third. Um, the one that's been the most transformational for my life um, began actually a little bit before teaching this course, but this course has deeply enriched it. But it began in real life, as it were, when we moved into our neighborhood in New Haven that we live in now. Has a large Orthodox Jewish community,
Hmm.
and I was at that time finishing my dissertation, and so that meant working all hours of the day and the nights and all days of the week. And I remember, um, one Friday evening as I'm trying to eke out. I mean, I don't know what I was thinking. Who's gonna have a productive thought at 11 p.m. on a Friday night? Like you
Just
should have
be
packed it
done.
in.
Yeah.
Should have packed it in. But I remember, working hard one of those Friday evenings, and downstairs we live in a duplex, and our downstairs neighbors are Orthodox Jewish, and at that point there were two young girls living in the house, and Friday night is Shabbat,
Yeah.
and they have to walk to synagogue, which means that their friends from synagogue all live within walking distance,
Mm.
and for whatever reasons on top of that, we would need to add on. Every Friday night downstairs was like a slumber party. For like after services, they like came back and it was like
Mm.
like 12 girls under the age of 12, like
Yeah.
having something. So I'm hearing these like giggling girls downstairs, and I'm just thinking, these kids know something that
Mm.
I need to learn. Like I'm banging my head against the wall
Right.
here, and these kids have a sort of joy and life, and they're receiving something as a gift, and that sort of began a process for me of um, coming to discover the sort of gift of Sabbath. That's
Mm.
actually, I think, part of my religious tradition as well, but one that I really saw lived out in really inspiring ways by my Orthodox Jewish neighbors.
I
And
love
then as
that.
I started in this course, reading the work of Abraham Joshua Heschel and of Jonathan Sachs,
Hmm.
and other Jewish writers reflecting on Shabbat and what kind of gift this is from God to receive the gift of limits of our creatureliness, of our humanity,
Yeah.
by having these 24 hours a week when we just don't work. We now, as a family, it's been almost 10 years now. We take, I mean, it's been more than 10 years now. We take a 24-hour Sabbath,
Yeah.
and we do it in sync with our neighbors,
Mm.
from Friday sundown to Saturday sundown, and it has just been. It's been a lifeline,
Yeah, I bet.
and for me as a Christian, it's made me reflect on, one of Jesus' famous Sabbath sayings, in which he says, the Sabbath was man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for man, and or the human not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for the human, and a lot of Christian rhetoric emphasizes the first part of that, but I hadn't really thought about the second half of that statement. Like, wait, the Sabbath was like made for the
It's a
human. Like,
gift to you.
this is a gift from God for me. So anyway, in our own sort of weak sauce, modern Protestant Christian sort of way, we have a Sabbath observance. I say weak sauce, right, in comparison to our Orthodox Jewish neighbors. The second example that it was really, really powerful was in a conversation with, or actually it was in the class. It was we have sessions with guest practitioners in every unit, and it was with our Buddhist guest, third or fourth year that I taught the class, and his Zen teacher, and one of our students asked him a question. We had been reading a bunch of texts in the Pali Canon, these very ancient Buddhist texts, but we'd also read some more contemporary Zen texts about compassion, and the student was having a hard time sort of fitting these two things together. The ancient texts seemed not to be compassionate in ways that the student had expected or hoped. Anyway, this Zen guest friend of mine answered and said, "Well, first of all, as a Zen practitioner, Zen folk aren't all that invested in the most ancient layers of the tradition." And he's like, basically like take it or leave it. But he said, but if you want to know about compassion, I think you got to think about the figure of the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva is the one who has achieved enlightenment, but for the sake of the world, for the sake of compassion, rather, returns to the world rather than sort of leaving it for a nirvana state, out of compassion. He said, if you want to understand the Bodhisattva and you want to think about ancient sacred text, I think you have to think about the Gospels. He's like, to this day, he's like, I can't read the Gospels without weeping. Because when I think of the Bodhisattva, the enlightened one who, for the sake of compassion, returns to the world, I think about Jesus. And first of all, I told him after the class, I was like, Steve, man, you're killing me here. These students know that I'm a Christian. They're going to think that I put you up to this. You're like my Buddhist guest, and you come in and like extolling, the Christian scriptures and the person of Jesus. But I'll tell you, as a Christian, I don't know that I would want to give up Jesus the Bodhisattva. That's an image that helps me understand Jesus better, right? This helps me understand when again and again in the Gospels, it just adds something else to those times in the Gospels when we read that Jesus, moved by compassion, right, did X, Y, and Z, which is common language for the Gospel writers. I'm not some like but what I love about that example in particular is that that's a lot of how it's sort of worked for me. And I sometimes like, I'll sort of tell on myself with my students, I'm like, before you think I'm so open-minded, notice what has happened here. I've engaged, Buddhist thought and I've come back with some insight about Jesus. So you can see I am sort of recalcitrant in my commitment to loving and following Jesus. Fair enough. Guilty as charged. But that's what it's looked like for me. It's not a smorgasbord of like, oh yeah, this insight from this and this insight from there.
I'm creating a new religion out of the best of all these, or something like that. Yeah.
Like I said, my commitment to Jesus is sort of boringly unwavering. But this engagement with these other traditions has helped me better understand the Jesus whom I follow and the life that he has offered me.
It's beautiful. Well, I have one last question, and it is something you've mentioned already as we've been speaking, but a phrase that comes up repeatedly in the book and that's come up in this conversation is the living lives worthy of our shared humanity. And I
Yeah.
love that emphasis that this is not only about a singular life, right? But
Yeah.
there's something that is shared and that our humanity itself is shared. So I wondered if we could end just with your understanding of that phrase. What does it
Mm.
mean? However you want to take this question, to live a
Yeah.
life worthy of our shared humanity.
I'm so glad that you picked up on that phrase.
Mm.
We have spent 10 years trying to ask this question, and I think that's become my favorite way of phrasing it.
Mm.
And for just the reason that you emphasized, um, there's this shared humanity that we're trying to explore and better understand and sort of discover and maybe even enter into more deeply together. Um, because it's really easy for all this to turn into some sort of self-help and like, here I am trying to live my best life.
Yeah.
Um, that's not what gets our students so animated around the table, right? What really gets us going is our sense that there's a shared project here. And
Mm.
not just in the sense that like we have a political life that somehow we have to figure out how to like put up with one another, but in sharing these questions, we share a quest
Mm.
to try to because we share that humanity, and we're trying to discover, how to lean into the deeper parts of it. I forget if it was Jushi or Mencius, one of the ancient Chinese philosophers, um, talks about a sort of like the greater and lesser parts of oneself. And I think there are these sort of greater and lesser parts of our humanity that we're sort of exploring together. My my favorite author that we interact with on this particular point in the book is Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Mm-hmm.
Her book Braiding Sweetgrass
Yeah.
is just a gift, and she sort of has this thesis that recurs again and again in the book. She's a Native American PhD in botany,
Right.
botanist. She she says all flourishing is mutual. All flourishing is mutual. And I love, there's just so many sides of that really simple thesis, right? That when we think we're flourishing at the expense of another, um, maybe we're not actually flourishing at all.
Right.
Um, when we when we see sort of paths forward that look like one could flourish at the expense of another, we're not even really understanding flourishing. When our imaginations most come alive, when we really begin to flourish, it will be because we're participating in, and especially for her as an ecological thinker, it's when we participate in an entire flourishing creation
Right.
that we are truly flourishing. And again, to be boringly centered in my own Christian theology, I see that in the Christian proclamation of the end of all things. That ultimately, I don't think we do, in a certain sense, fully flourish in this life. I think that's an important part of
Mm.
Christian expectation, is that, especially if you lead your life well in this life, it won't go well.
Mm.
At least not always.
Yeah.
And sometimes precisely because you've led it well. If
Yeah.
you stand up for what's right, sometimes you'll take it on the chin.
Mm.
But the long trajectory at the capital E end of all things is not Amy Julia flourishing. It's not Matt flourishing.
Right.
It's not even just the human community flourishing. It's the entire creation flourishing in this garden city, or somehow some sort of non-competitive full blossoming of both human culture and the natural world.
Right.
Um,
And that seems right, and that seems like one of those things you don't see it everywhere, but that is maybe a point of an overlapping consensus in a number of traditions, at least, that if we want to imagine full flourishing life, we're not just imagining a single life, we're imagining a whole world set right. What Kant called the kingdom of ends, right?
Yeah.
The kingdom of ends for him, or the mutual flourishing of Robin Wall Kimmerer, or the New Jerusalem of the seer of the New Testament. Again, we'll probably disagree with one another about exactly what that world looks like, but the question we're asking is broader than just any one life.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking back to the New Jerusalem because I too have been, my imagination and hopes are shaped and formed by a biblical vision of that, and that sense of the diversity that continues to exist within that space, I think is also a part of that shared humanity.
Yes.
That these
Every
are,
tribe,
the
every nation,
every
every
tribe and every
tongue.
nation, like that this is not something where everyone becomes the same, but actually where everyone is valued, because in part of that diversity and that sense of giving and receiving to one another. And I do think that the relationality and the love as a grounding truth for me certainly is how I get at and have begun to get at these questions of what it means to live a life worthy of our shared humanity, is to understand love in relation to God, to self, but also to neighbor. And that can take us a long way. And I agree, there's a lot, not just within the Christian tradition, but within a lot of different thinkers throughout the ages, including Robin Wall Kimmerer from our own age, who can teach me a lot in the midst of that. Well, thank you, Matt. It's been really nice to share this time with you. I could ask you questions for hours, but I'm not going to do that. And I so appreciate the work that you all are doing.
Thanks so much for this conversation. It was really fun.
Thanks, as always, for listening to this episode of Love is Stronger Than Fear. If you received something meaningful from this conversation, please share it with others and let me know. I love hearing from you. My email is amyjuliabeckerwriter@gmail.com. I also want to thank Jake Hansen for editing this podcast, and Amber Beery, my social media coordinator. She does all the behind the scenes work, and I'm so grateful for her. And finally, as you go into your day today, I hope you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.